Welcome back to my reflections on the English 333 class, and today we're going to be looking at the coming of print, which is our second unit. For our first question of who is printing and how are they represented in their products, I just wanted to talk about how we looked at the beginning of the rag paper production process in this unit, and the beginning of the printing press, and the different kind of qualities of those, the different characteristics that each of those individual processes bring to kind of print culture. And I guess I'll start with the printing press because it's so revolutionary in this period, right? We move from the manuscript to the printed text because of the Gutenberg printing press, though obviously in the course we've looked at other forms of printing that are that precede the Gutenberg printing press from all over the world, and I'll get into a little bit later in one of my later questions about this idea of like kind of Gutenberg and the progressivist myth of the printing press. But for now, it's just very interesting to look at how, if we're asking the question who is printing and how are they represented in our products, we see a little bit of a slight detachment from the physical product of printing and how the printer is represented in their product in this period, at least in comparison to the last one, in that we're moving away from the hand-lettered text towards the machine-printed text. And I think that's quite interesting, of taking the person, or at least deconnecting the individual from the text. But, of course, in this period, we also see that, and I'll talk about this more in a second, but this idea that people were partially printing texts, but because people expected or wanted hand-lettered texts, that they were also doing decorations, like kind of margin decorations, but also certain letters, like those very tall, elegant letters that you might see at the beginning of a page, doing those by hand, but having the rest printed. And so people were still putting themselves physically by hand into the product, and I think that's quite an important point. A way we physically see people represented in their products in this period that also develops with kind of the rag paper processes, which obviously we've looked at. Rag paper persists for I think the next 2 units, or at least until kind of the 19th century. Paper is made from rags of mostly linen, but I know we've also talked about hemp and cotton in later periods. That doing this process requires getting the materials wet and kind of smushing them together, to use a technical term. And this is also when we see, because of this process, the development of watermarks, which I know we only talked about kind of briefly in the course, but I thought it was really interesting because it's like, even though we see people taking themselves out of the printing process, their kind of handiwork or hand marks out of the process of printing in this period, as we move away from kind of hand-lettered culture. People are putting their watermarks onto paper, the people who are producing the paper. So we kind of see a reinsertion of the human into the print process, and also this idea of like ownership, which I feel like will come back as we talk about kind of copyright later in other periods, and kind of just like regulation of printing, which is obviously a part that regulation is also kind of part and parcel to this this period, because as printing becomes more and more, and this will come up in later units, but as print comes into its own, we also see more regulation on the production of texts. And I think that that's also quite important, that there's this new kind of control over what is printed and who is printing and how they're printing it, that also emerges as we get print culture over the predecessor of like kind of manuscripts and handwriting kind of culture. For the question of who is reading and what do books mean to them as objects, I'll go back to that point I made earlier, which is that books were often kind of mimicking manuscripts in that they were mechanically printed but hand finished. And we mentioned a quote in class, this idea that they're not actually trying to look like manuscripts, they're trying to look like books. And I thought that was really interesting, that because this is like what a book looked like, or what a text looked like, with these certain decorations, with these conventions of manuscript culture being brought into print, that they weren't trying to look like manuscripts, they were just trying to be what texts were. I think it's really interesting, especially because later in the course, and I feel like I keep talking about things ahead of myself, but because of later in the course we talk about the kind of skeuomorphism in digital text, so this kind of like text like an iPad or a Kindle sometimes have the page flips which are trying to look like a book, and it kind of makes me think, like, are those devices trying to mimic, like, are they trying to mimic books, or are they just trying to be what a text is and like adapt what we think of texts and how we like to consume text? And it makes me, that's what I think of when I think about this idea of these texts not trying to look like manuscripts, they're trying to look like books. Another aspect for the topic of who is reading and what do books mean to them as objects that was brought up was the development of italics by Aldous Manutius in order to meet increased demand for classical literature, as more people were able to read and text spread, and how italics allowed more text to be fit into the page. And I think that's really interesting because we see like the impact of the reader onto the physical form of the text, kind of how in the last unit we looked at, I spoke about how scripto continuum shows how people were reading, and that you don't need to, you need to not be able to, you need to already know the text in order to read scripto continuum. And here we see another form of how people were reading, or what kind of people were reading, what level of education, etc. How this was creating more demand for books, and so books needed to be shorter and not use as many resources, and so you could print in italics to fit more words on the page to make smaller books. And so we see, like, in the physical way that the text itself is being presented shows us who the reader was, and I think that's really interesting. For the question of how do we interact with historical book objects, and how do we imagine print history, and what are the terms on which we approach it, I kind of want to talk about them together, because for this unit, something that stood out to me, specifically because of some of the readings we did in this unit, such as the one on Ottoman printing, and just some of the discussions we had about the way print was preceded before, like, around the world prior to the invention of the Gutenberg printing press. I just wanted to mention this idea of kind of the mythologization around the printing press, and how I think a lot of times in history classes, at least in like the US where I'm from, or just kind of like in the West, the idea of the printing press is that like it suddenly resulted in this massive spread of information, and it kind of unlocked the key to like enlightenment around the world. And while it's not untrue that printing obviously spread a lot of information, a lot of ideas, because of the accessibility of text now, I think that this idea that like this one man and his one invention changed everything and kind of made everything better for the entire future, I think is just this kind of real, when I say mythologized, I don't mean it's a myth. I think that there's truth in that story, but I just mean the kind of sanctity that we put on this story, and how it's kind of this sacred invention of printing that kind of saved people, and it saved the world in terms of its ability to spread information. I think is just one to be not doubtful, but kind of critical of, and think through, why do we think of text this way? Why don't we think? Because like in the Ottoman printing unit, it kind of concludes with this like wonderful statement that I think has stood out to me, and also other of my classmates, of this like just question of like, why print? Because the author presents that there was lots of resources for handwriting texts in the Ottoman Empire, and not necessarily a need to print, so why print? I think it's just such a crazy question to read when you've been raised with this kind of the mythologization of print, that like, well, why wouldn't you want to print? Printing, like, it saved the world. And so I think that it's important to be critical of why we expect printing in other cultures. Why do we compare them to European printing? And just this kind of progressivist myth that print kind of brought everything forward into the future, that everything is always going towards the future, I think is just something to be critical of and to think about. And I think it's something that's really informed how I've thought about kind of printing throughout this course. Today's animation is some little floating printed pages in a little kind of modern adaptation of a black letter font, kind of like we would see with Gutenberg's kind of black letter printing, with the pieces of movable type, because movable type is such an important part of the coming of print and the printing press, little pieces of movable type moving around. That's all for me today, and next time we will be talking about the expansion of print.